You're standing in the private chambers of Versailles in 1715, and the smell hits you first. Not perfume, not roses, not the lavender they claim masked everything. No, this is rot. Sweet, thick, cloying rot mixed with something metallic that coats the back of your throat. King Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, the man who built the most opulent palace in human history, is dying. But he's not dying quietly in some dignified royal tableau. He's literally decomposing while still breathing. His left leg has turned completely black from gangrene, and the physicians, those brilliant men of science, have decided the best course of action is to let him watch it fall off. Not amputate it cleanly, understand, but to wait for the necrosis to complete its work, so the limb will simply detach on its own, like fruit from a rotting tree. The courtiers are required to attend him daily, to sit in that room filled with the stench of dying flesh, to smile and nod, and pretend their king isn't actively putrefying before their eyes. Because here is what history books do and tell you about absolute monarchy. When you've spent 72 years convincing everyone you're re-chosen by God, you can't just admit your body is failing like some common peasants. You have to perform divinity even as your flesh liquefies. Let me take you deeper into this particular nightmare, because the gangrene was just the finale. For months before that, Louis had been suffering from what court records delicately called digestive troubles, which is 18th century code for his intestines were essentially rotting inside him. The royal physicians had developed a treatment protocol that involved daily enemas, sometimes up to 4 a day, administered in front of an audience, because privacy was a concept that didn't apply to kings. They used a mixture of water, wine, and various herbs, delivered via a specially crafted gold and silver syringe that was, according to one courtier's diary, the length of a man's forearm and twice as thick. The king would lie on his side on a specially designed table while his doctors performed this ritual, and court etiquette required that certain high-ranking nobles be present to witness that the procedure was done correctly. Think about that. Your job, your actual court-appointed duty, was to watch the King of France receive an enema while you made polite conversation about the weather or the latest hunting expedition. The courtiers developed an entire vocabulary of euphemisms for these sessions. They called them the king's necessary audiences, or hygienic consultations. One lady of the court wrote in her private journal that she could always tell when it was enema day because the king would wear his loosest robes and walk with what she described as the gait of a man preparing for battle. But here's where it gets truly grotesque, where the intersection of royal privilege and medical ignorance created something almost beautifully horrifying. The doctors became convinced that Louis's problems stemmed from an excess of black bile, one of the 4 humors they believed governed bodily health. Their solution was to induce vomiting as frequently as possible to purge the corrupted humors. They created what they called emetic wine, a mixture of wine and antimony that would cause violent projectile vomiting within minutes of consumption. Louis was required to drink this several times a week. The court records, kept with meticulous detail by the king's personal physician, describe sessions where Louis vomited continuously for over an hour, producing such quantities of bile and partially digested food that servants had to empty their receptacles multiple times. And because this was the Sun King, because everything he did was theater, these purging sessions often occurred during the lever, the morning ritual where dozens of courtiers would attend the king's waking. Imagine it. You're a duke or a count. You've been waiting for hours for your turn to be admitted. To the royal bedchamber, it's a tremendous honor. And you walk in to find your king projectile vomiting into a golden basin, while a physician cheerfully explains that this is a sign the treatment is working, that the bad humors are leaving his body, all while Louis tries to maintain some shred of dignity between violent heaves. The gangrene itself started almost casually, the way these things do. A small wound on his leg, nothing dramatic, probably from catching it on a piece of furniture. But Louis was 77 years old. His circulation was already compromised from decades of gout, and his doctor's preferred treatment for any wound was to apply hot poultices made from bread, milk, and pigeon dung. Yes, pigeon dung. They believed the heat and the vital essences from the excrement would draw out infection. Instead, they created the perfect environment for bacteria to thrive. Within a week, the wound had developed a characteristic smell that the physicians initially celebrated as evidence that the corrupt matter was being expressed. Within 2 weeks, the flesh around the wound had turned gray, then purple, then black. The blackness spread, climbing up his leg like spilled ink soaking into fabric. And still the doctors insisted their treatments were working, that the discoloration was part of the healing process. They wrapped the leg in bandages soaked in wine and herbs, changed them 3 times daily, and each time the smell got worse. Each time more of the blackened flesh would stick to the cloth and peel away. And each time Louis would watch with the detached fascination of a man observing his own mortality in real time. By the final week, courtiers were making excuses to avoid the royal chambers. The smell had permeated everything, soaking into the silk wallpaper, the velvet curtains, the elaborate tapestries. It lingered in the corridors outside the king's rooms like an invisible fog. The servants assigned to the king as care were rotated every few hours because the stench made them physically ill. But they couldn't open windows because August heat and fresh air were believed to be dangerous to the sick. So the room was kept sealed, stuffy, the air thick and warm, perfect for accelerating the decomposition that was already well underway. The physicians had stopped pretending the leg could be saved. Now they were just waiting, checking daily to see if the bone had separated from the putrefied tissue yet, discussing in clinical terms how much longer it might take. Louis, to his credit or his delusion, never screamed. He would watch them unwrap the bandages, watch the blackened flesh slide away in strips, watch the bone gradually emerge from the rot like a stick pushed through overripe fruit, and he would simply ask when he might walk again. The doctors would smile and nod and say, "Soon, Your Majesty, very soon." And everyone in the room knew they were lying, but no one could say it because you could not tell a king chosen by God that he was turning into carrion while still breathing. The final days were almost surreal in their horror. Louis developed what the records call a fever of the brain, which meant he was septic, his blood poisoned by the infection consuming his body. He began having conversations with people who weren't there, giving orders to long-dead advisors, arguing with his deceased wife about matters of state. The physicians interpreted this as a spiritual visitation, a sign that he was communing with the divine in preparation for his ascension. In reality, his brain was being starved of oxygen and flooded with toxins, shutting down in the messiest way possible. He would have moments of lucidity where he'd realize what was happening to him, where the fog would clear and he'd look down at his leg, at the exposed bone now clearly visible through the shreds of blackened tissue, and you could see in his eyes that he understood. Then the fever would take him again, and he'd be back to discussing battle strategies with his grandfather. The court painters were brought in during one of these lucid moments to create a final portrait, but they had to work from memory later, because Louis kept drifting in and out of consciousness, and also because the smell made it impossible to stay in the room long enough to complete a sitting. The portrait they eventually produced shows Louis in full royal regalia, looking noble and composed. It shows nothing of the reality, nothing of the gangrenous leg or the smell or the way his eyes had taken on that glassy, distant look of someone who's already partially left their body. When the leg finally detached, it happened during the night. The physicians weren't present, just a single attendant who later described hearing a soft, wet sound like fabric tearing underwater. Louis apparently didn't wake during the actual separation, but when morning came and they changed his dressings, the lower portion of his leg simply came away with the bandages, still wrapped in the cloth like some grotesque gift. The physicians were called immediately, and they examined the severed limb with professional interest, noting how cleanly the bone had separated. discussing whether this meant the body's natural healing processes were working correctly. They seemed to have completely forgotten that their patient was still alive, still dying, just now doing it with one leg instead of two. Louis lived for 3 more days after that. 3 days of drifting in and out of consciousness, of his remaining leg also beginning to blacken, of his organs slowly shutting down one by one. The court continued its rituals around him because ritual was all they had. The lever still occurred each morning, though fewer courtiers attended. The couture still happened each evening, the formal putting to bed of the king, even though Louis was already in bed and hadn't been conscious enough to participate in days. He died on September 1st, 1715, 77 years old, having reigned for 72 of those years, the longest reign in European history. The physicians performed an autopsy and discovered that his internal organs were, in their words, in an advanced state of putrefaction, that his intestines had essentially been rotting inside him for months, that the gangrene in his leg had been the symptom, not the cause. The cause was decades of royal privilege translated into medical practice, decades of physicians too terrified to admit their treatments weren't working, decades of a system that valued theater over reality. They embalmed what was left of him, a process that took days because there was so much decomposed tissue to work with, and then they paraded him through Paris in a funeral procession that lasted 6 hours. The crowds were smaller than expected. People stayed home, whether from grief or from a growing awareness that maybe absolute monarchy, maybe this whole system of treating human beings like they were fundamentally different from other human beings, maybe that was the real disease all along. They buried him at St. Denis in the royal crypt in a coffin that had to be specially sealed, because even embalmed, even preserved with all the techniques available to 18th century mortuary science, the smell lingered. Visitors to the crypt in the years that followed would sometimes report a faint, sweet, rotten smell that seemed to come from Louis' tomb specifically, though that might have been imagination, might have been the power of suggestion, or might have been evidence that some decomposition processes, once started, never fully stop, that some rot goes down to the bone and beyond. The Sun King, who had built Versailles as a temple to his own divinity, who had spent 7 decades convincing everyone, including himself, that he was fundamentally different from common humanity, ended his reign as proof that we're all just meat, all just temporary arrangements of flesh that eventually fail in the most undignified ways possible, no matter how many gold enema syringes you own,